Hello, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed that short break. We are going to be moving now to a discussion around pride of place, investing in infrastructure and restoring the community through pride of place. Now, levelling up pride in place is described as restoring a sense of community, local pride, and belonging, especially in those places where they have been lost. The aim is that for every place in the UK to have a rich endowment of all six capitals, which I will go into in a moment, so that people don't have to leave their community to live a good life. Taking action to replenish the capitals where they are weak or depleted will help to transform vicious circles into virtuous ones. That's the hope anyway. So what are these capitals that I mentioned? One is physical capital, so that's infrastructure, machines and housing. Human capital, which is the skills, health and experience of the workforce. Intangible capital, so that's innovation, ideas and patents. Financial capital, resources supporting the financing of companies. Social capital, which is the strength of communities, relationships, and trust. And finally, institutional capital, so local leadership, capacity, and capability. So that does sound ideal to invest in all those capitals, but how do you do that? Well, to join me for a special fireside chat, we have Nathan Pardoe, who is the Cabinet Member who is in charge of inclusive economy, regeneration, digital transformation at Cheshire West and Chester Council. Welcome, Nathan, to our virtual stage. And just to say to those who are joining us, perhaps you were with us earlier or you're joining us for the first time, this is really an opportunity to put any questions that you might have to Nathan so that he can share his experience in terms of what the council has been doing. So we really encourage you to use this chance really to put your thoughts, your questions to Nathan, and I'll try and put as many of those questions to Nathan. If you could just put those questions in our question box, which is at the bottom right of your screen, and I'll keep an eye on that. And of course, as well as the questions to Nathan, any thoughts that you have, please do share them on our social media platforms, so LinkedIn and Twitter. There is a hashtag, just to remind you, it's PSE-365. But let's get talking now about this subject, pride of place. Nathan, just to get us started, could you just sort of share what you do in terms of your role and how that relates to pride in place?
I've got sort of three distinct parts to my role that you mentioned. The digital and public services reform. There's also the economy and economic strategy, and bringing as many people along with that. But the key bit and the most relevant bit for this is the regeneration aspect. And I think the local authorities are under more pressure than ever, and regeneration is one of those things that I think sometimes can be looked at as the thing that perhaps doesn't matter. It's the future, and we've got the back to basics. But I'd argue that regeneration is the back to basics way to deliver the pride of place, because communities, when the sense of feeling left behind, all of that is tied in with this. And the only way to change that is to say that the close down, shops, the units, the town centres, the city centres, we need to get life back into them. And as part of that as well, you've got things like the change in retail. The big thing that I have to confront and the officers I work with is that that's not going to change back. And I think most people, accept that now. But instead of just saying retail's changed and that's the end, what do we do instead? And it's answering those questions. In terms of Cheshire West, we've got projects, a decent mix. There's plenty in delivery. So I'm also a councillor in Winsford Wharton, and in Winsford we've got a major town centre regeneration project that's in delivery. We have other projects that are in quite an early stage, so development frameworks and sort of conversation starters. And it's an interesting one because you've got sort of a full spectrum. You've got the local authority acting as a facilitator and working heavily with the private sector, or for the project that's in the town that I represent. That was full public ownership and sort of public sector involvement to correct years of market failure.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nathan. So, I guess one aspect to look at is funding. I'm going to start there because obviously, we know that the climate that many local authorities are working at the moment is incredibly difficult. So, how do you protect regeneration ambitions when there are squeezed budgets that everyone is having to work with?
I think really it starts with being a champion for it. So as I said, a moment ago, the whole point of regeneration can be lost. It's not essential, but it absolutely is. It's the hopes of a community, really, and you've got to be vocal champions for it. The obvious reason to do that is the economic benefits. If you think about particularly sort of smaller to medium towns, they tend to end up having this sort of commuter mindset. So how do you get people back in the local economy? How do you keep people in town centres, city centres? It's all tied in with that. So it starts with having people who will advocate for the programmes in themselves, recognise the economic benefits, but also talk about the social benefits, the pride of place, and the overspill effect, because you have to start somewhere. And I think the regeneration ambitions, the hardest bit or the bit that I always found most difficult is we're here, we need to be here, but what are the phases to get there? And that's where being the advocate comes into it, because you have to be honest with the community that we all want to get to the same place, but it will take time. The leveling up funding that's available, it is definitely welcome, but it's coming at a time where hope is low, really low, and you've got the sort of general economic picture, but the decay, if you like, public realm, town centre, the voids left by retail, that is all so visible, and it's really hard for communities to imagine what could be different. And I think with levelling up funding, the ask really from, I suppose, anyone in my role is it should be equitable. It has to be done with the community and based on need, because the risk is that sometimes the funding can end up being, two communities against each other in the same area, and that's a challenge. That the funding at a high level, is almost the straightforward part. It's the allocation and the fairness that matters.
Yeah. And, you mentioned the kind of the phases, how do you get from here to here? And, in your experience, obviously you mentioned there's a big regeneration project going on at the moment in the area that you represent. But how do you build thriving towns and city centres? What do you see as kind of some of those key phases that need to be supported?
I think obviously there's the retail changes, but it's more about what is a new town centre. So for me, people have to be living in our town centres again, and it's a mix of residential options. But if people live there, then that solves a big part of the problem of footfall. If there are people there, then there's dwell time. With more people spending more time in towns, that helps businesses, and it also helps the non-retail uses. Town centres now and city centres, they're all about experiences. So the town centre in Winsford, as it is, pre-regeneration, I couldn't say to my family, let's go and spend some time there, because there isn't anything to do, because the retail mix has changed. So it's about giving people reasons to go, because people will go and spend in local economies. The question is it the one where they live, or the one a bit further away? So it's opportunities. It's all about living, working, and the opportunity for play as well. And that comes up a lot in programs across the country, that if no one thing fills the retail void, and I think recognising that's key to making them sustainable as well. So in other parts of the borough, we're looking at things like skills and employment training in town centres, because that then gets people into town for different reasons. And that should hopefully help, weather the future. Because if you look at the historic configuration, it was just on the assumption that retail-led, it will always be fine. And the problem with that is what we're seeing now, that when habits change, the thing that your town centre or city was designed around, goes away. And it's a particular challenge in smaller towns, because there isn't something else to fall back on. There probably isn't a heritage or tourism economy as there would be with a city. So you do end up with whole towns just feeling forgotten. So, for me, thriving town centres, it's a diverse mix, but particularly residential.
Yeah, brilliant. And just a reminder to those who are watching, maybe you've just joined us, if you've got any questions or thoughts really as we're talking, please do pop them in our Ask Your Question box, and I'll try and interweave them into our discussion and also put them to Nathan as well, to share his insights. Nathan, you mentioned there, and I think it's something that's been obviously going on for a really long time, this change in retail, and the kind of, like you mentioned, there needs to be a focus more on different experiences. What kinds of experiences do you think need to be introduced? I know it will be different depending on where you live, but could you just kind of expand upon that a bit?
So it depends, place to place. The obvious, one in a lot of places is, food and beverage, but it's leisure activities. So sometimes you end up with gyms in town centres, or more leisure activities. It's definitely place based, but it's things that it's the hook that gets people into the town centre, because the retail bit, it still exists. There's still the appetite for it, but people won't leave the house for that on its own, and it's changing that mindset, really, as I've said.
Yeah, and so, from the perspective of a local authority, should you be more than facilitators in this process of, in pride of place? Is there a different role that a local authority could play?
Yeah, absolutely, and if you're going back years, the expectation was that councils had they could do, well, not everything, but they could do a lot more. So the pressures facing local government are no secret, and it doesn't really matter where you are in the country or who's in control of the council. Those pressures are well known, so that it's not in that moment the council could say, well, it's too difficult, we won't get involved anymore, and it's over to just to happen in other ways. So the council's got the facilitation role for sure, and we see that in Cheshire West. So as I've mentioned, regeneration frameworks and sort of overarching plans to try and bring together different sites, and they're really useful in towns like Northwich, for example, where there's a mix of land ownership. So no one person will be able to deliver all of those, but at least then you can articulate this. These are the hopes of a community. This is what we want, and you've got something that's got weight. Beyond being a facilitator, as I mentioned, in places like Winsford, there was just market failure. The private owners, it's not necessarily that they wouldn't invest; they couldn't invest, and they I think they were affected during the sort of economic collapse and financial crash of 2008. They never recovered from that. But what that means in the community is the town centre was decaying. So at that point, the council had to be incredibly ambitious and bring it into public ownership. So the options vary, and I don't think there's one universal. But despite all the financial challenges, I still think councils have to be bold, and that could be in different ways. So the ownership argument is probably the far edge of that. But even to have the confidence to say, to a community, what do you want in your town, in your city, and to build in the understanding of phasing as well, because people, there's always really agreement of what people want. It's just the time to get there, and I think councils are really well placed to help build that support, build the links between different groups, and hopefully bring private partners to the table as well.
Yeah, and kind of looking at the bigger picture when it comes to levelling up and central government, what more do you feel that government could do to help propel the levelling up agenda? Obviously we've spoken about the significant funding, 4.8 billion pounds, I believe. Is that enough? What more do you need to help you as a local authority?
It's probably, for the projects I've been involved in, it's understanding of the how that funding will be allocated. So there were two bids put in Cheshire West, one for transforming the market in Ellesmere Port, and one for major infrastructure investment in the Wennington Bridge corridor. So it's sort of an old swing bridge that's beyond its useful life, single track. It's a massive traffic bottleneck. Lots of issues are well known. And Ellesmere Port Market, the market works, but the design of it and the visuals from the outside especially don't work. So they're both different parts of the borough, both really strong bids. And the Ellesmere Port bid was successful. The Wennington corridor, bridge corridor wasn't. Now, from government, and what would have been better perhaps would be some indication that there would be future rounds, and it would help with going back to the community to say, well, this bid wasn't successful, but don't worry, it will come back. And it's that sort of forecasting, is probably the way I can put it, that would really help, because the total sum of money is absolutely useful, but it's the community hopes or community disappointment that's the hardest bit to manage. Because from the local authority side, when a bid's rejected, then the narrative becomes, the bid was a waste of time. But it wasn't a waste of time. It's ready, it can go into future rounds, and the bid was strong. And it's that almost transparency around the criteria, because if there's confidence that there's future allocation rounds, there's confidence that they're fair, that message can then go back to communities. And that surely has to be part of levelling up, because otherwise it just feels in a lot of places that all the promises before that didn't come out, this is another one, and nothing will ever change. And that's what's really tough with funding programs like this, that if once that perception of fairness starts to drift, then a large part of the community, they stop listening, and they just think it will never happen.
And so what could, if you could speak to government and say, if you change the bidding process in this way, it might help, like you say, build trust, rather than have that sense of people feeling really demoralized within a community when a bid is essentially rejected. What might those suggestions be?
There's two parts really. There's the part for sort of council staff. So as I understand it, the bid timelines are quite tight. So you've got the shift in what the staff are doing, and maybe if there was a grid, for the period ahead, that would help shape how the bids are put together. It would then drive the public facing side of it. So there could be ownership then from both sides, that we know this round is coming up. We're going to put the bid in. The government will look at this bid in good faith, and we will know by X. And that early warning is probably the wrong way to put it, but awareness that would really, really help. The risk is that because the timelines tend to be quite tight, it kind of ends up in an all hands on deck mindset, and I don't think that helps either side, in fairness. Whereas a longer timeline will help get that buy-in, and hopefully, and whatever the outcome, it will help avoid that or minimise the disappointment.
It's that planning period to really have that, and it kind of made, obviously it's different, but it made me think a little bit about the sort of city of culture bids that happen, and that sense of places bidding in that respect. And there's always a kind of a real structure and timeline, and obviously it's sort of a different bidding process. But how that I, as a reporter and journalist, I covered when Leicester bid to become City of Culture many years ago, and what they did in that process was collate so much information that some of those things happened regardless of that bid not being successful. But there was a long-term kind of timeline to that, I guess, that enabled that to feel less demoralizing when they didn't win the bid. In terms of levelling up, though, and bringing the community with you when it comes to regeneration, we're speaking a lot about when bids don't, you mentioned the one with the Ellington Bridge, when they are rejected. How do you keep that community momentum and that belief that an area will have regeneration?
It starts earlier, and it's probably different with bids, but it's more the overall project. So you have to have meaningful engagement with people, and the tendency, particularly with local authorities, is that we do things to people, not with. I don't always think that is fair, but it is definitely the perception, and it should be flipped on its head. Really, it should be that we do things with people, not to them. So that means engagement, and it has to be all the digital side, different channels, but town hall meetings, real, physical models of plans, and buildings, and making it accessible. And with that's the only way to include underrepresented groups, because if you look at the traditional consultation mindset, the people who are engaged in consultations are the people who will complete the next one. So it's not that the views don't matter, but are they fully representative of a community? Probably not. The other element that's interesting, particularly with the smaller towns, is, I mean, I get asked often, why haven't we got a Primark coming to Winsford? Why haven't we got cinemas, bowling alleys? And it isn't within the gift of the council, to do that. And their sort of commercial decisions based on big population, catchment area, all the things we know. But people ask that. So how will people ever know the answer to that if you don't have those conversations? The other element, I think, is the links with the community, because if you think about bids and different towns, if people have those conversations and probably more cross community, then if the town down the road does get some investment but you don't, it stops that, or helps reduce at least that feeling that it's not for you, because it is for you. If you can get there, there'll be transport there, you could drive there, however you want to get there, it's still for you to enjoy. And it's that element of regeneration that I think is particularly tricky, that everyone thinks in a place mindset, but it's always broader than that. And it's the link between communities that are a particular challenge for local government. And if tying it back to the Levelling Up Fund and how it is being distributed, that's probably something that government could help with, because it's the promotion that your area is benefited, even if it isn't necessarily your town.
Yeah, that kind of wider area and that sense of claiming that as part of your community. Just a final question, really, Nathan, because it's been brilliant having you here, sharing your experience with us. I guess in terms of investing in infrastructure and pride of place, why do you see it as vital in terms of the kind of the health of community? I mean, I talked about the different capitals before introducing you and why they're important to invest in. But from your perspective, from what you've seen tangibly change or not change, why is this something that you care about?
As in caring about regeneration, I suppose without it, it reduces. I don't even mean local government. I mean government to quite functional. Councillors, we always talk about things like frontline services, and that's fine probably in this setting. But if you say to a resident or a community group, frontline services, that's what we're protecting. It's not that people don't care; it just doesn't mean anything. But if you say what we're working on is the future of your town, that. It's not that it feels important. As I said before, it's the hopes, aspirations, and it's the transformational element. Because if you get regeneration right, it isn't just about the shiny and new thing that's been built, but it's about all the jobs it creates, all the opportunities, the social spaces. Because particularly post-pandemic, the thing that was missed was that interaction. And if you don't have the spaces to go, the spaces to be, if you don't make places, and if people don't feel proud of them, then on a longer timeline, it really doesn't bode well for society, I guess. So for me, I'm passionate about it because it makes such a difference, and I really believe it has to be community led. Because otherwise, even if you can build the thing that you want to build, the risk is that people won't feel it's theirs, and it's that sense of ownership that's particularly important, especially now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nathan, for giving us your time and for a really illuminating fireside chat. Really hope that you've enjoyed listening. Thank you, Nathan, for your time. Nathan Pardo there from Cheshire West and Chester Council. We are going to take another quick break now before our next panel discussion. During that time, I'd really encourage you to explore our PSE 365 platform, which does feature our digital marketplace, and there's also opportunities to connect with other delegates in our virtual space too. We will be back at 11:35 for our next session, so I'll see you then. Goodbye.